We all get ideas. Some of us get those ideas when we're in the shower. Some of us have ideas that come to us in the midst of a dream. And so many of these ideas, at least at the time, feel like they're the story you were meant to write. But then you get into Act 2 and you feel the story start to unravel or fizzle out, or all that potential that you thought was there just isn't. How do you know which stories are actually worth writing? And how do you avoid this nightmare situation of writing 60,000 words of a story only to then discover that you don't have a story? What separates this fleeting thought, this fleeting moment of inspiration, from a story that you will want to spend a month or even months or years on? Today, we're figuring that out. Welcome to the Writing Theory Podcast, a podcast for every level of writer. Everything that we discuss here on this podcast is about pushing you to the next level of storytelling, from prose to structure to the business of writing. You can join me every Monday for a new episode, a new topic, and a new takeaway that you can apply to your own writing right away. I'm Carson Long. Let's get started. We've talked before about how long writing is. It's a long form art. You have to really commit to writing, and you have to have a lot of discipline to stick with it. And if you sit down and write a story, well, you better hope that you've hitched your wagon to the right idea. Is that not kind of a strange saying? Maybe it's outdated. Replace that with a modern analogy. Because it's really hard to make a lot of progress and have the passion and the fire and the excitement, and then it all just peter out because you find out that your story idea just didn't quite have legs. And we'll talk about why that may be. And we'll talk about how a lot of it comes down to you trusting yourself to be able to tell the story. Now, I should go ahead and say that you, the author, listener, you are not on this earth to write one single story. And a story doesn't exist in your head in like a single state. It's not something that's in your head and you have to bring it out of your head into this perfect picture. And if you don't do it, then you fail. It's not like that. It's not like you're discovering the exact right words to tell the story. And if you get one of those words wrong, then your story is wrong. And that's not it. Your story is an expression of yourself when you write it. The way that you write a specific scene is going to change based on, it's going to sound crazy, what day you write it, what music you're listening to, what else is going on, what mood are you in. If you sit down to write and you're mad, or you've just gone through a breakup, or you've just lost someone close to you, the way that you write that next scene in your book, it's going to be very different than how you would have written it otherwise. That's just how writing is. So with that at least being understood, that when you write a story, it's your story at that time in your life. Let's talk about where so many of our story ideas come from. And maybe one of my hottest takes, and one that I think a lot of people might disagree with. Let me know what you think in the comments. So I'm going to sit here on my high horse, I guess, and tell you that I don't think you should be writing down all of the different story ideas that come across your mind. You should not keep a writing journal with all your potential stories. Now, so many writers might swear by those writing journals, but I think they're holding you back, at least in one very specific way. Now, it may be that writing down every potential story idea may sound like a great strategy, right? These are all the potential stories I could tell. But I think it actually dilutes your ideas down and makes it harder for you to pick out and focus on the best ideas. And I know, like I said, a lot of people feel differently about this. This is maybe my second hottest writing take. I should phrase it like that, my second hottest one. I've mentioned my hottest writing take. It's about the appearance of your protagonist. We're not going to get into it right now. But here's the deal. So a writing journal is typically a place for you, and a lot of people even treat this like a dream journal. It's a place for you to say, I just had a great moment of inspiration for a story that I could tell. And I'm going to have someplace, the notes app in my phone, a special journal, something where I can write down these story ideas. But here's the issue. You were not meant to tell all of those stories. You're not. I hope you tell a ton of stories. I hope that you fill the world with all of these expressions of yourself, but there are so many fleeting thoughts that come by that we think are good that when you put them down in that same writing journal alongside other ideas that come to you that probably have a better chance of being written, you're building up this chance that you're never going to get to those good ideas. Because what do you do with a writing journal? When you want to write, you crack open that book, that notes app, that Google Doc, and you say, what's a good idea to write? You look through the list and you say, I'm going to write this one. That's what I'm feeling like today. And I think too many ideas sort of end up becoming filler. Now, I've heard other people say different things about this. I've heard other people say that I'm writing all of these ideas down, and then when I am going to tell a story, I'm going to be picking out more than just the one. I'm going to be picking out a story that feels like I'm excited and ready to write, but here's another idea that I can combine with it and make an even more interesting idea. And you've heard me say time and time again, a story worth writing needs to come from two unique ideas. I'm not going to quote the Stephen King Carrie inspiration again. I think I've done it like 9 times. I think, there's some potential here with combining these ideas. But instead, we're going to talk about what I think is a better way to do it in just a second. I think there's 2 main issues with writing down every story idea you have. One, like I said, your maybe not as interesting ideas are taking up more room in your journal. You're obscuring the more well-rounded ideas. And when you're thinking of what you want to write next, you might be more attracted to this one idea that's flashy, but it just doesn't have the right depth. But the other issue is that I think a lot of writers get distracted by the shiny new story. You get to act 2 in your story and you're like, oh, I got past the inciting incident. I just don't quite know how to get my characters from this point all the way through the rest of the novel to get to that ending that I know I want them to have. This is the hardest part of the novel, the middle 50%. In the traditional 3-act story structure, you have your act 1, which is the introduction and the inciting incident, and the kickoff for your journey. That's 25% of your story. That's easy to plan, and to be honest, fairly easy to write. The final 3rd act of your story is another 25% of your novel. Roughly, we don't really operate by saying I can only spend a quarter of my total word count on writing the conclusion. It's not really how it happens, but this is like the general framework idea. You typically know, or at least in my experience, please let me know if you feel differently. In my experience, I usually know where I want this story to go. I either have the conclusion already figured out, or I have a scene in mind that is deserving of being the ending. And I'm kind of trying to work towards that. It's the middle 50%, act 2, where everything else in your novel happens. And everything you do is either developing character relationships, moving the plot along, providing a plot twist, creating tension, creating a climax, creating a resolution. That's the hardest part of your novel to write. And in those moments of difficulty, a lot of times that's where a writer may say, you know what? I'm not super inspired to write today. I'm going to step away. Oh, hey, you know what? There's another great idea in that writing journal. What if I started planning that story instead? And then you get stuck in this loop. Of course, this doesn't happen to everyone. Of course. But that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. So what's my philosophy as someone who doesn't write down all of the story ideas that come to their head? You've heard me say it in some videos maybe before, but it's the idea that the stories that have legs, also a weird saying, the stories that have that depth, the stories that you are really passionate about, whether you write them down or not, are going to stick in your head. There's a quote from Stephen King that's kind of like that. Having a story journal is like fishing with a net, a fine mesh net. You're going to catch some big ideas, but you're going to catch a lot of small ones too. And that just makes it harder to get to the good stuff. It's something like that. But it's something that I think I believe pretty wholeheartedly. Now, do I not write down anything about my stories? That's a false statement. I do. But let me tell you how I do it. First off, I mostly just internalize my story ideas. And I can tell you right here, right now, there's about 6 different story ideas in my head that I've carried with me for years, sometimes up to a decade, that I want to write. And I never forget any details about them. I'm always aware of them because they are so exciting to me. And I'm so passionate to go and write them. I think the best ideas stay with you. Now, that being said, this is coming from the perspective of someone who has the opportunity to not write them down, who has the ability to be able to remember things fairly clearly. So it is totally fair to say, if you struggle with these other, struggle with memory, write it down, of course. But in my case, I don't write them down. And if I have an idea that comes around and I'm like, this would make a killer story, and I don't write it down and I forget about it, I feel like I haven't lost anything because maybe it just wasn't meant to be. Now, in this meantime, when I'm just sort of when I have this idea in my head, I'm kind of passively planning it. Every now and then I come back to one of those ideas and I'm like, oh, what if this main character did this thing instead? And it's just a very general knowledge of the story. But I feel like you can kind of tell what feels like what's right for the story. And so instead of obsessively writing down every idea, I kind of just trust my brain, not even to filter out ideas that maybe aren't as bad, but to really latch on to the good ones. And do I really need to have more than 6 stories that I'm prepared to write at any given point in time? I don't think so. There's never been a moment in time for me where I've been like, man, I just don't know what to write. I have always have these ideas that I'm itching to go for. And I'm writing one of them right now. It's called Upon Careless Gray Hills, a murder mystery set in Whittier, Alaska. You can actually see me writing that story in real time in the Novella November playlist that we did this past November. I wrote 45,000 words of that story on live stream, and you can even pull that playlist up and write along with me in the past. We hang out for a little bit in between writing sessions. We have dedicated writing times. It's just a ball. We just have a good time. So here's my recommendation to you. If you are someone who writes down all of your story ideas, I don't think this is a bad thing. But what I would recommend you do instead is maybe to grab one of these field note journals. It's only got, I think, like 36 pages, maybe 42 pages, something like that. I love those field note journals. And what I do, if I am going to write something down, and I've played with this in the past, and I kind of like it, sometimes I kind of don't, is I just write the name of one of my stories on the front of that cover. And I'm not going to have 36 of those field note journals with 36 different stories on it, but I'm not opposed to the idea of having a little journal I can flip open and write stuff down about that single story. Now, instead of writing down every single idea that I have, I'm always further developing a story I truly believe in. So if you would like to write something down, consider this approach instead. So for those great stories that seem to stick with you, the ones that I don't write down, how do you know when to write them? That's really hard, especially because sometimes it feels like, even though I don't believe this, sometimes it really feels like there's a story you're meant to tell. And I think everyone has a story that's kind of like their baby, if you know what I mean. Now, I'm going to go ahead and stop and say, as a rule of thumb, I think it is totally worthwhile for you to stick out one story idea and try to finish it. Even if it's a short story, even if it's a novella, even if it's just a couple of scenes. But to actually set a goal and complete that thing. When I wrote Starlight Farm's Kennel for Talking Dogs, the goal was just to write a novella and have it out in the world. And I wanted to share that with everyone. And I wanted to learn even more about the writing process. And what happened was I went into writing that novella thinking I knew a lot about my writing process. And I feel like I got a lot of it correct. I knew how I like to write. But I'll tell you, there were still so many things that came up that I was not prepared for. Things like hating my own word choice for a scene in a novel and being like, I need to completely rewrite this. I didn't think that would happen to me. And it did. I rewrote that whole book. I still think it might have been a mistake, but I did it. I found out that you can get stuck in this endless loop of editing. And so I set myself a pretty firm round of edits. I'm going to do, I think the number was 5 or 6 or 7 edits. And by the end of that, I'm putting the book out. And I think that was the right move. I think I could definitely get stuck in this endless circle of editing hell. But I was only able to see all of that by finishing something. I was only able to see that part of the writing process and to learn all of those lessons by seeing it all the way through to the end. Now, I was trying to write a story that was 40,000 words, something like that. Not a huge endeavor, but still one that takes a lot of discipline, time, and continuous writing sessions. I think Scrivener says it took me 17 writing sessions to finish that first proto draft of the novella. 17 days of sitting down in front of the computer and writing. And when you think about it like that, that is so feasible. You can do just about anything 17 times, which gets me so frustrated because I'm in a slump with my own writing. And I'm like, bro, if I can just sit down and write 15 times over the next 2 months, I'll have my next book completely done. Now, that being said, let's go back to story ideas. I'm just being real with you. Back to story ideas. I say you need to stick something out and finish it because you'll learn a lot. And I also say that because it is always tempting when things slow down to want to jump to the next shiny idea. And you'll never finish anything like that. But when you're in between projects and you have these ideas in your head for what to write next, how do you choose between them? Because I'll give you a couple pointers. There are some book ideas I'm 70,000 words into the proto draft for. And I haven't written anything for this book in 3 or 4 years. And the reason is I feel like I am so much of a better writer now than I was 3 years ago. I feel like I need to redo it all over again. And you may also have this feeling sometimes where you want to write this idea for a story. You've held on to this idea for so long, but you don't know if you're good enough to meet your own expectations for writing that story. And that's a tough feeling to have to go through. When you're looking at all of these potential ideas and you're thinking, what should I write next? It's pretty simple. If you can't stop thinking about an idea, it's worth writing. These big ideas that stick with you. And the one that you're most excited about, go write it. Even if you think, oh, you know what? If I was a better writer, I could finally do this book justice. That is a toxic mindset. You're meant to write so many more stories. Write the one you're excited about. Write the one you have the best chance of finishing. Maybe that should be the advice. Write the story you have the best chance of finishing so that you can learn so much more about your writing process and do it all over again on the next story. You might come back to the same idea time after time. Maybe you have a story where you've started that proto draft 4, 5, 6 times. And each time you do it, you get a little bit further. Maybe you start writing it and you don't like it as much as your last try. That repetition of you coming back to that story again and again, that means it's important to you. Go write that story. Don't ditch the story you're in the middle of to go write it though, just FYI. I think excitement is maybe one of the biggest signs that you're ready to write it. If you're excited about an idea, if you've been excited about this idea for days, weeks, months, years, that's a good sign. You are more likely to finish a book that you're excited about than a book that you're just phoning it in. If the idea excites you, the more you think about it, it's worth exploring. Now, the best stories to write aren't just the stories that are interesting to you, but the stories that draw you, the author, in. If an idea keeps calling to you, don't ignore it. But of all of those ideas, what do you pick? You're excited about more than one of these. That's why they've been in your head for years. Well, the truth is, a cool premise, an interesting premise of an idea isn't quite enough to tell a full story. One of the videos I'm really proud of is all about coming up with story ideas, taking them from idea to being ready to write. I've actually got 2 videos on that topic. One is how to develop an idea into a story. And the other one is specifically how I took Starlight Farm's Kennel from Talking Dogs from that very first inkling of an idea, thought about it, developed it, and then eventually formed it into a plot framework. If you want to see how I did that, you can check out that entire 4-part series. Something being interesting to you is just the start of it. When you dig deeper into a story idea, there needs to be more story there. And there's a couple good things that can happen. So first off, know that you have the skill of a writer. You are a storyteller. The more you dive into a story, the more potential you end up seeing in that story. Ooh, if I paired these 2 characters together, the reader would love that. They'd have a great repartee. Is that it? They'd have a great interaction. They'd have conflict. They'd learn about each other, and the reader would get to see it all. You start to see these elements of stories that you can dive more into. That's a great thing. That's your skill as a storyteller, tackling one of your ideas and just making it better, seeing all the different avenues that writing can take. And that's a skill you develop by finishing projects, by taking stories to the end. One of the best things that can happen when you're writing a story is that you get invested in your characters. When I was writing Starlight Farm's Kennel for Talking Dogs, I know it's a long title. I'll try not to say it too many more times. Link in the description. When I was writing that story, it started with me just doing my due diligence. I'm going to show up and I'm going to put words on the page. I'm going to shoot for like 2,000 words a day. Some days I'll hit 500. Some days I'll hit 5,000 words. But I'm going to put in the work to start building this story. And then something crazy happened. I started discovering these characters in a way that made me excited for them. And why is that important? Because that became a motivating factor for me to write, to simply bring these characters to the next step of the story. Once your writing starts to get motivated by your characters, you're going to finish that book. That is a positive feedback loop. You're going to write more, understand your characters more, be excited to explore this world with them, and that's going to make you want to write more and develop those characters more. Stories with depth have a better chance at this, and you being excited to write and explore that world and write those characters and show the reader everything that you want to tell them, that is a positive feedback loop. That's what you want. A lot of people will talk about things like theme. Theme is so important to the story. What is your story, if not the message that it tells the reader? I don't go into stories with a theme. Very rarely. I will say I have done that before. And when that happens, that's really good. I have a very strong sort of idea for what the reading experience for this book should be. But most of the time, I don't have a theme really ready to explore. But in naturally telling that story, I'll discover that, okay, this story kind of is about this thing. And then when I'm editing, I'm going to make the story reflect that even stronger. If you have a really strong theme going into your proto draft, that can also help you sort of explore that depth. But also remember, it may be in your editing process when you start to figure out, okay, this is kind of like the underlying message of my story. Now I'm going to reinforce that in some places and cut out things that go against that theme. That's some great advice from Stephen King, the man himself. I'm still super interested in exploratory writing. We've talked about this on the podcast. That's the Wisconsin to me coming out. We talked about this in the podcast a couple of times. It's the idea that you're going to write a bunch of stuff for your story that's never going to make it in the manuscript just to help you figure out your story better. N.K. Jemisin, author of the 5th season Broken Earth trilogy is what I think it's called, speaks about writing the first chapter for their book 100 times with different characters, different perspectives, different atmospheres, different tones, in different locations, having different things happen. And in that process of sort of figuring out how they want to present the story, they sort of refine that idea. They chip away that big marble statue that's going to be their story into the form that helps them see the end. Which means maybe that story that you want to write, that you've been thinking about for years, maybe you need to explore it a little bit before you're actually ready to write it. Can this story be told from another perspective? Do you have the right main characters? Has your understanding of this story in your head evolved over time, or had any new questions come up that you haven't really figured out? Has your life experience changed how you look at the story? That's another good thing to remind yourself of. For me, I have the story I've been sitting on for a while, and I did some exploratory writing. I had 5 characters I thought were interesting, but I don't really want to write a story with 5 perspective characters. So I started writing sort of this core scene, this idea for like, what's this defining moment for each one of these characters? And how do I feel about them after having done some exploratory writing? And that helped me see that, okay, here's a character I like, but here's a character I love and I see potential in and I see depth in and I want to show the world to, and I want to see everything through their eyes. Exploratory writing helped me find that out. Good story ideas, these stories with depth, they unfold as you explore them. And if you haven't experienced that yet, you will, I promise. Ideas with depth keep growing, especially as you plan and think about them. And even when you start writing them, you start to discover so much more. If you are considering writing a story, take your idea, do some exploratory writing, put pen to paper, and really think, am I ready to put in months of my life into the story? Maybe years. If you're not passionate, if you're not excited, if you're not interested in being with these characters or in this world for the next couple months, then your chance of finishing that really drops. That being said, there is one cheat code to all of this. While the best stories excite you and motivate you, your best chance at finishing a story is to trust yourself to do it. When things get hard, when your routine gets interrupted, trust yourself to have the ability to say, I'm going to come back to this story, I'm going to sit down in front of that computer, and I'm going to keep writing. If you find yourself getting stuck in Act 2, trust yourself to go to that plot framework and break down your story in a more detailed way. I've told so many people this. If you keep hitting writer's block, especially if you think that you're a pantser who's meant to just discover the story, don't worry about an outline, I'm just going to start writing and I'll get there. You may not be a pantser. You may need to explore something like this headlight writing method. Check out my podcast on writing routines where I discuss that in more depth. That's episode 1. As an author, you have the power to take an idea from a note in a book, in a story journal, to a full novel. You have those skills. It's just a matter of showing up, putting in the discipline. Trust yourself, trust your process, evolve your process, and keep writing. That's it for today's episode. Thanks for showing up. thanks for giving it a listen. I got an email today saying that this podcast is ranked number 29 in the education category for Finland. We are on the rise. If you found this podcast helpful, encouraging, motivating, fun to listen to, not a waste of time, give it a rating on whatever platform you're listening to. Come join us in the Discord. Be part of our entire almost 500 writers in the community Discord. You can find a link to the Discord in any one of my YouTube videos. While you're there, of course, subscribe. I have a great time doing these. I got a new microphone, so I hope it was easy to listen to. Let me know what you think about the ideas and the thoughts of this episode in the comments below or over in that Discord. I read every single one, and I love the discussion that we get to have. With all that being said, I've had a great time. I hope you get out there and start writing, and I'll see you next Monday.